And so, yeah, I was going to tell you about this 3-year study that I did with some colleagues in Northwestern California and in Oak Woodland in Neeland. And so this was led by Gabe Goff, was the grad student on the project. And then I had a number of faculty colleagues that were also involved. Here's a picture of the site. It's really beautiful. And yeah, I'll tell you about our deep dive into this site. Let me see here. Okay, there we go. So I'm sort of preaching to the choir, so I'll keep this really quick here, but oak woodlands are a really neat landscape, as you all know. They're incredibly biologically diverse, important culturally, sort of these iconic landscapes of the Pacific Northwest. And in recent decades, they've been on the decline due to a number of reasons, notably, urban development, agricultural development, so loss of habitat, and then conifer encroachment, largely due to fire exclusion, letting conifers kind of get their foot in the door. And similar to Erica's talk, if I don't get through all my slides, that's fine, no big deal. I tried to put together things that I thought would be interesting to your group, but along the way, as I'm talking, if you have questions or want to make it more conversational, please feel free to chime up and we can talk about stuff if you want to know more about a certain topic. And so in Northern California, here's some work that came out of our lab group, Maddie Shriver, another grad student. Over the past 50 to 100 years, there's been, about 30% loss of oak woodlands in California, largely due to conifer encroachment. And so here from Maddie's work is just showing that the white portions of the column are oak establishment, Oregon white oak establishment. And you can see really since the 1850s, so again, kind of fire suppression, that these oak establishments have become really reduced on a declining trend. And we see the red portions of the columns, the Douglas fir establishment, really increasing across time. So we can see graphically, backed up by data, kind of in Northern California, this loss of oak woodland perpetuation. And so our study site in Neeland, you can see here from these two photographs, the level of conifer encroachment over recent decades, over the past, since the 1950s or so. And so we had 10 plots and we had a number of questions that we wanted to answer. The study design was set up where we had 2 sort of open, unencroached plots. And then we had 4 moderately encroached plots, 2 of which were thinned with conifer removal. And then we had similarly 4 heavily encroached plots, 2 of which were thinned. And so we were interested in, what are the effects of conifer encroachment on these woodlands? And then what are the responses of oak woodlands if you go in and you remove the conifers? And so specifically, this was, again, a really big project with a lot of co-PIs and stuff. So I'm just kind of carving out a little bit to talk to you about today. So the questions I was going to talk to you about today were, how does microclimate vary with encroachment and treatment? So treatment being conifer removal. And then how does oak physiology vary with kind of season across the growing season, across the Mediterranean summer? Encroachment and then treatment, and also just more broadly looking at how these oaks are responding to climate. And then finally, because it seemed from my emails with this group that you were interested in kind of fire risk and fire vulnerability, a portion of our project also looked at kind of fuels in these different kind of treatment types. And so a question that I was going to talk with you about is, how do surface and live fuel moisture levels vary with encroachment and treatment? So that's kind of where I'm going to go on this talk with you guys. And here's some pictures just showing kind of the differences in the types of stands we were working with. So open versus heavily encroached. And so for our first question, sort of what were the effects of encroachment and conifer removal on sort of the microclimate of these plots? This picture, I think, nicely summarizes it basically, and it's palpable when you're in them. The heavily encroached plots were really damp. Like you walk into them even on a hot summer day and it's like, ooh, it's kind of chilly in here. So the conifers, really do an effective job of shading out the oaks. And so you have reduced solar radiation getting into the plot. You have reduced wind getting into the plot. So generally less evapotranspirational demand in these plots, which really decreases is the vapor pressure deficit, like how thirsty or drying is the air from the tree's perspective. And so as far as fuels go, this means that, or as far as moisture goes, this means there's a lot more moisture in these encroached stands compared to the open stands, which gets a ton more like wind, so breezes wicking water away, and then also a lot more solar radiation getting into them. So the open stands much drier and the encroached stands much wetter when we just look at moisture levels and microclimate variables. So that's good to know. And then for the physiology component of the work, just to help kind of make more sense and give context to it, we had 3 years worth of data. So 2017 was like before we took out the conifers, and then 2018 and 2019 were our 2 years where we could evaluate responses to conifer removal. It'd be great to do a further like longer term study looking at, because we also went in and did prescribed fire in the plot. So it'd be cool to go back in 5 years and kind of look at longer term responses. And things that we measured physiologically, which I think might be of interest to some of you if you're wanting to put in kind of like long-term monitoring plots on some of the treatments that you guys are putting on the landscape. These might be things you could consider if you're wanting to kind of monitor oak responses. So we measured water potential using a pressure chamber. We also use stem psychrometers, but I'll just present to you today the pressure chamber data. And then we tried to tease apart kind of where the firs and the oaks were getting their water from in the soil. So are they competing for water, or is there niche partitioning of water? What's going on? And so we use stable isotopes to look at that. And then we also use the lower picture here, leaf pyrometers, which are a really easy, like user-friendly plant phys toy to measure gas exchange or stomatal conductance as kind of a proxy for productivity. And then I'm not going to have time to talk to you about it today, but we also looked at biodiversity, so plants, mammals, and birds. And I can, offline talk to anybody who's interested in those data too. And then finally, we used kind of climate data and our physiology data to see how the oaks were responding to climate. And we got really good at pole pruning. So I can also talk to you about pole pruning. We could pole prune with like 8 sections on the pole pruner. Here's Gabe showing off his pole pruning skills. And we had to do this in the dark to get pre-dawn physiology measurements. So anyway, it was very comical field work at times, trying to pole prune to get foliage to be able to take these measurements on. Anyway, okay, so what do we find? I'll show you some data, and again, feel free to chime in. I don't mean to have this be like death by graph, but so here we're looking at water potential, so a measure of water status, and on the vertical axis you have hydrated at the top and then like water stressed at the bottom. And so what we can see here, I'm just showing you 2 years worth of data, but you can see a seasonal trend, those orange arrows. So across the Mediterranean dry summer, we see this drawdown of water availability and kind of increasing water stress. So the winter rains are becoming exhausted, and we see increasing water stress through October in the onset of the winter rains. And then if we want to look at the encroachment level on this figure, you can see the dark green columns. Those are the heavily encroached stands, and kind of jiving with our microclimate data on fuel moisture. We can see that the heavily encroached stands have much higher water status, the oaks in the heavily encroached stands, compared to the oaks in the moderately encroached and open stands. So again, kind of when thinking like, okay, what is the actual mechanism of how conifer encroachment is killing oaks? It's not water stress, as this evidence suggests. It really has to be a story of light limitation, not water stress, based on these data. If anything, the conifer encroachment is like helping oaks in terms of their water status. They're very hydrated. And so kind of to complement those data, we have the stable isotope data. So we have water from oaks and then their closest Douglas fir. And so we can see in all of the encroachment levels, so open, moderate, and heavy, that there was a significantly different isotopic signature in the oak and Doug fir xylem water samples. And so this is indicating that the oaks are getting deeper water, at least at the time that we did our sampling. I don't know about the whole year, or the whole growing season, but in August, the year that we sampled, so a dry month, the oaks were getting deeper water than the firs. So suggesting that they're not in direct competition for the same water within the soil profile. And then interestingly, so it's like, okay, well, whatever, I guess like the oaks aren't water stressed, so we don't need to be worried about drought. I mean, conifer encroachment isn't, adding to their water stress. So drought is not probably a big deal. But interestingly, when we looked at the climate data along with our physiology data, there's a lot in this figure to explain. So in the interest of time, I'll just kind of boil it down. But basically on the vertical axis, we have midday water potential. So like as stressed as the trees will be in a given day. Again, low on the vertical axis is more water stressed and high is more hydrated. And so what you can see, and then the red lines are under a wet scenario. So a low vapor pressure deficit, and then the blue lines are under a dry scenario. So high vapor pressure deficit, where the air is really thirsty and drying from the plant's point of view. And so what you can see is for the heavily encroached stands, they're really sensitive to these changes in water, in vapor pressure deficit. So when the climate gets drier, we see a much bigger increase in midday water stress in these oaks. Whereas if we look at the open stands, the red and the blue lines are really close together. So the oaks that were grown in the open stand conditions, like hotter, drier conditions, they're more acclimated to higher VPDs. So you don't see this increase in moisture stress at the middle of the day. So this is suggesting that perhaps the oaks that are growing in these heavily encroached conditions might be a lot more sensitive to a drying climate. When we look at gas exchange, so, how productive the trees are, the oaks, we can see the seasonal trends across 3 years. It looks like, gas exchange kind of peaks around earlier in the growing season, like June, July, and then kind of tapers off through October. And this makes sense given it's a ring porous species where early in the growing season, they're laying down really big, early wood vessels, a big carbon sink. So they have high productivity. There's tons of winter precip available. So high productivity early in the growing season, and then a slow drawdown of that productivity across the growing season. So that's good information just in terms of understanding how these trees function. And then if we look at it through an encroachment lens, we can see again, the dark green columns are the heavily encroached stands. And we see that, by and large, almost in every sampling month across this 3-year period, they have significantly lower gas exchange rates than the oaks in the moderate and open stand conditions. And so again, kind of suggesting here that it's not a water story, it's really a light story that's limiting gas exchange in these oaks under encroached conditions. So light starvation. Another kind of interesting fold to the story is so plants can regulate their stomata in response to the environment around them. And this can be to conserve water when the climate gets dry. And so we noticed, these are all Oregon white oaks at the same Neelan site, just different stand conditions. And it was really interesting because we noticed sort of different stomatal regulation strategies occurring in the different stand types, which is sort of cool. And it suggests that there's some sort of like physiological plasticity in this species that maybe will make it really adaptable to changing climate, to drying conditions. And so in the open and moderate stands, we see this positive relationship or correlation between leaf water status on the x-axis and stomatal conductance. So this is kind of, if you will, plants behaving isohydrically, which is kind of the norm for stomatal regulation strategy. So when there's lots of water, stomata are wide open, gas exchange is happening at high rates. And then when water is limiting, the leaves are water stressed, stomata close, and gas exchange tapers. But interestingly, for the heavily encroached oaks, we saw this really starkly different trend, like they were marching to a totally different beat. So for the heavily encroached stands that are so light limited, when they had low water potentials, so really water stressed water potentials, their stomata were rocking out and doing the most stomatal conductance. So again, sort of an interesting find and could definitely warrant further investigation, but does suggest physiological plasticity within this species, which is kind of cool. And hopefully will help it be resilient and resistant to drought. Okay, there's again, a lot going on. So far I've just sort of been talking about encroachment responses, like how encroachment alters these oak woodlands and also the oaks themselves. And then here looking at conifer removal, like how responsive, like what does conifer removal do physiologically to these oaks? And so it's sort of a lot in a 20-minute talk to walk you through this figure. You could stare at it for a while, but this is looking at at pre-thin, so 2017 in the lighter columns versus post-thin 2018. And basically in the different kind of unthinned and thinned encroachment levels. And so I put the take-home point here in purple font. So the net here is that conifer removal did not meaningfully like affect oak water potential. So this is good information in terms of implementing conifer removal treatments, because if we, from my previous data, if we're showing that, hey, like conifers really kind of buffer oaks against water stress, like oaks in conifer encroached stands have a lot higher water status than oaks in open grown stands. So there could be a concern that if you go in and you remove the conifers, will the oaks suddenly be under tons of water stress? And these data are suggesting that no, that didn't happen. So I think that that's helpful information to have. And then as far as gas exchange go, as far as the gas exchange goes, again, it's sort of, I think this is helpful information for people on the landscape implementing treatments, conifer removal treatments, because you want to allocate your efforts and your resources where you're going to get bang for your buck, you know? And so there could be some stands where you're like, oh, is this stand like past the point of no return, you know, heavily encroached stands, can they even rally? Can they even respond to conifer removal? And so this is showing gas exchange to model conductance. A value of 1 means no change. So it's looking at post-treatment over pre-treatment. So again, a value of 1 would mean no change. And anything over 1 means increased gas exchange following treatment. And so I think most notably here, what we see is that, well, in the moderately thinned stands in both years, both post-treatment years, 2018 and 2019, we had increased gas exchange rates. And so that's cool. But we also saw for the second year that in the control unthinned plots, so maybe it was more just a climate thing. But for the heavily encroached stands, what's really cool, and I circled them in orange, is that we see a really big difference between the unthinned and the thinned stands in terms of gas exchange, where in the first year, particularly post conifer removal, we saw a big spike in gas exchange in the heavily encroached oaks, whereas in the unthinned stands, there was a decrease from pre-treatment gas exchange rates. So this is showing that, yeah, those heavily encroached oaks are responsive, very responsive to these thinning treatments at the leaf level in terms of responding to an increase in light availability, which I think is encouraging. So some other work, and I'd be happy to chat about this sometime with someone, because we're still head scratching about it a bit and trying to square it. But so all of the kind of, you know, data, when we look at microclimate and fuels, like they're all showing that, that the conifers have this kind of like wettening or dampening effect on the oaks and the plots. Except then when we look at a growth-based analysis, so this is Jill Beckman's work, she did her master's on this project. When we look at a growth-based analysis, again, using post over pre to quantify drought resistance, we can see that the light columns here are the Douglas fir encroached oaks versus the open grown oaks in the darker columns. We see that the conifer encroachment really reduces oak drought resistance. So at the end of the day, when we look at the oak's growth, previously I've been showing you kind of physiology data, but when we actually look at the oak's growth, we see this reduction in drought resistance. So even though the firs seem to have this kind of dampening effect on the oaks, we nevertheless, when we look at their growth, detect that the firs have a negative impact in terms of drought resistance in the oaks. This work by Jill, I mean, and I was part of the team, but led by Jill, she also showed that the Douglas fir, again, we've got here on the vertical axis basal area increment, which is just a metric of growth. And we can see during that drought period, the kind of 2012 through 2016 drought, that the Douglas fir were really sensitive to the drought, so much lower drought resistance, kind of as Erica was saying, that white oak is notably drought resistant. So we see a much lower decrease in growth in the oaks during the drought compared to the Douglas fir. So suggesting that perhaps over time, maybe drought will be more negatively impactful to the firs compared to the oaks. But we can see here that overall, the Douglas fir encroachment is just really reducing oak growth. So the hashed turquoise line at towards the bottom of the chart area. And then from some of Divine and Connie Harrington's work, we can see that, you get more bang for your buck, kind of the more conifer removal that you do. So looking at longer term responses and growth to conifer removal. And so I think that's an important body of work too to consider in this story. And someone chime in, I don't have a timer going, so I practice the talk, but if I'm going over, give me the hook or whatever and tell me to be quiet. Okay, so I just have a few more slides. I've been working recently in like the past year or so in Zoom, and we're starting to get the project off the ground, but working with the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership on some black oak plots. And they've been finding with the Karuk tribe that a lot of these legacy black oaks that they really want to save, they're culturally really important, that after they go in and do some conifer removals, that then the oaks that they're trying to save are failing and dying, that there's really high mortality post conifer removal. And so we're trying to come up with a project. I'm kind of picking people's brains about it, happy to have a dialogue if people have experience with this, but we're thinking about trying some sort of like a pruning or coppicing treatment on the oaks. It seems that after we go in and remove the conifers, that then the oaks are often very vulnerable to wind throw, and they're already kind of legacy. They're sort of like, a lot of them have a lean to them, and that shortly thereafter they, have major stem failure or huge branches falling off or just completely uprooting. And so we're going to try this coppicing treatment to see if we can kind of lower their top heaviness, making them less vulnerable to wind, and also stimulating a bunch of epicormic branching to increase leaf area after they've been in these shaded suppressed conditions for so long. Anyway, happy to chat with anybody. And if you maybe email me or something, if you have questions or ideas or experience with this.
That's interesting. I'm curious, we'll have to watch it.
Yeah.
Kina Bugner with the Washington Department of Natural Resources just released a stand of oak that are pretty mature and have that kind of architecture of an open grown tree, but they've been pretty heavily encroached on by conifer. So they got released this last fall.
Yeah, and they're doing some more this year. So
well, we'll watch.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. And then there was, in my email exchanges with folks here, it seemed like there was some interest in fire vulnerability. So Jeff Kane, part of our research team, he's the fire ecologist at Humboldt. He led some work on this study looking at fuels. And so, it's like on the one hand, encroachment, it increases fuel loads, right? There's more vegetation in the stand, so more to burn. But it also, I've been showing you, increases kind of moisture. So here's some data just looking at Douglas fir. This is live fuel moisture. So like in the actual foliage of the trees, the live foliage. And so what you can see, basically the red lines are the heavily encroached plots, and then the blue are the thinned plots, or for the oaks, the open plots in green. And so basically the take home here is like, hey, yeah, we can see it in the trees. In their foliage, the encroachment really increases moisture. So making things less vulnerable to, even though there's more fuel, they are wetter fuels. And so less vulnerable to fire. And so this could be a concern or just something to weigh in when thinking about it. So treatment, by opening up the stands, it reduces your fuel loading for sure, but it also makes things more xeric. It drops the fuel moisture. So things might be more vulnerable to burning in that case. And then here's just kind of another glance at those data from a different paper that Jeff put out from this site. And I know it's a multi-paneled figure, but basically it's looking at surface fuel, so not live fuel like in the tree, but Douglas fir, litter and 1 hour fuels and 10-hour fuels, and then also some kind of fermentation layer and humus and grass. And so the net here is just that you can see the encroached stands, again, those maroon kind of lines, those have the greatest moisture. And so in the thin stands, the yellow, you can see that thinning drops moisture levels. So again, possibly making things a little bit more vulnerable to burning. So take home points, thanks for riding along with me on this whirlwind of information. So I guess to distill it down to some gems that you can walk away with. One would be conifer encroachment reduces oak water stress and gas exchange. So the big negative there is that it's reducing gas exchange. Conifer removal does not meaningfully increase oak water stress, so you don't need to worry about that as far as my data show. And the conifer removal does have the capacity to increase gas exchange in the residual oaks, which is really encouraging. Conifer encroachment makes stands wetter, and conifer removal makes stands drier. So just factoring that in terms of kind of thinking about fire vulnerability. And then some management kind of action items from this work, all arrows kind of indicate that conifer removal should be aggressive. If you're going in there and taking out the conifers, go big. And then heavily encroached stands are responsive to treatment, like not all is lost. They do at the leaf level at least, and in terms of growth, seem to be able to respond to conifer removal treatments. And with that, I'd like to thank my funders and all the collaborators on this project. I'm going to have time for questions if anybody has some.